Great. Yeah, okay, great. Hello, everyone. Uh, Good afternoon, and welcome to today's colloquium, at which Itzel Aurora Garcia will present. Let me first say that Professor Gates sends his regrets. He can't be here as he's in DC to accept the American Academy of Sciences and Letters Barry Prize for Distinguished Intellectual Achievement, honoring those whose work has made outstanding contributions to humanity's knowledge, appreciation, and cultivation of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Yeah. Our introducer today is Charles Martin. He's a fellow here at the Hutchins Center at work on Optical Thinking, a book of his photography and text. Now retired, he has served as a professor of Afro-American Studies at Brown University, of English at West Virginia University, and of Comparative Literature at Queens College City, University of New York. His photographs have been included in such books as Picturing New York, Photographs from the Museum of Modern Art, Committed to the Image, Contemporary Black Photographers, and Deborah Willis's Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the Present. In New York, he is represented by June Kelly Gallery, where he has had 8 solo shows, as well as the recent Faces, Figures, Fantasy, the inaugural exhibition at Global Vision Art Gallery in Brooklyn. His museum solo exhibitions include Museo Histórico e Artístico do Maranhão in Brazil, Maranhão, Musée Public National d'Art Moderne et Contemporaine in Algiers, and Musée de la Halle Saint-Pierre in Paris, and Alice Austin House Museum in New York. Please welcome Charles Martin.
Hello, everyone. As you know, one of the recent honorees of the Hutchins Center is the distinguished actor LeVar Burton, who appears in Cameo's video, Word Up. It is a humorous depiction of a commanding police officer who, along with his crew, is a menace, but ineffectual and outdone by the raucous, vibrant energy of the music. In the attempt to stop the music, neither he nor his crew employ unseemly tactics, nor do they have any advantages. In the world we live in, however, there's very little funny about the police or policing. As a kid on the outskirts of Philly, where Frank Rizzo was first police commissioner and then mayor, that's late 70s through 1980, I far too frequently saw headlines about his opposition to desegregation of the city's schools, and equally appalling, the police department's general disregard for human rights, particularly drawn along racial lines. The Philadelphia Inquirer sometimes wrote about this. In earlier times of slavery in the United States, we know that the government authorized immoral laws that, for example, made it illegal to give aid to some persons in need, those escaping from enslavement. Itzel Aurora Garcia takes serious consideration of the functioning and malfunctioning of the force of police and the related neutralizing of citizens because of assumptions of authority of the police. Assumption as in an idea, and assumption as a takeover. Itzel gives attention, of course, to foundational institutional support taken by the police. Order is not to be taken for granted. In an undergraduate course, way back when, that I took in sociology, the professor over the term built a case for anarchy. Anarchy not as a state of disorder due to absence of authority or controlling systems, but anarchy as organization of society on the basis of voluntary cooperation without political institutions or controlling government. Nevertheless, the professor did not see the police as problematic, but simply as the extension of law. Itzel wields a more insightful and critical view and analysis of the police. She looks at the law generally and its enforcement, i.e. the enforcers. Itzel is a multilingual, speaking Spanish at home, San Diego, California, where her parents' English was only slightly developed. She learned English at 4 or 5 years old in school. She was also drilled by her parents as a toddler, when most are oblivious or carefree, to be able to say when crossing the border between California and her family's original Mexico, to be able to say to the guards, "I'm a U.S. citizen." So she has always been aware of encountering the police. Itzel's language skills have expanded to include Italian and some French, and of course, she is fluent in the language of philosophy, which was her undergraduate major and continues to be her field as a professor at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, in Los Angeles County. Subsequent all this to having received the PhD, as in Doctor of Philosophy, in philosophy at University of California, Irvine. She has been called by her students such a caring professor who really wants her students to do their best, offers help if they're struggling, and does much to help them get the highest grade possible. Itzel is a person of diligence and even harbors a desire to return to the study of sciences and receive a degree in that as well. She looks out and administers, even admitting to bossing or taking charge of her younger siblings in, according to her, polite, delicate ways, but bossing nevertheless. Her name, of Mexican and Mayan origin, boasts the definition of rainbow and nectar and dew towards a bright side of life. The multi-layered nature of the rainbow may be as well a reflection of her brightening the zodiac sign as a Gemini. Given her complexity, it seems that if the California band, the Beach Boys, had been fortunate to contemplate someone like Itzel, their song California Girls would have had a few more verses, more dimensions, and been intricately complex. Itzel is generous of spirit and sensitive to its lack, particularly when that lack is authorized by institutions and permitted or disguised by those who serve as arms of enforcement. Things need to be done. Itzel is on it and showing the way for others to act as well. The meals here at the Hutchins Center are always excellent, and Itzel Aurora Garcia will be giving us essential food for nourishing thought and action through her consideration of law, morality, authority, and our possible responses to these important forces. Let's eat up her words and give a warm hungry, and attentive welcome to Itzel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chuck, for that very colorful introduction.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here, for taking time out of your very busy schedules to come and hear what I have to say. Thank you also to the organizers of this event, to Dr. Lewis and Justin, who made this poster that is incredible, and I'm definitely going to steal some of the copies that are around the building to take home. And also thank you to Sean, who, as Chuck told us, always provides a delicious lunch, and I can't wait to see what we're going to get after this. So I'll try to be maybe briefer than I should be. Thank you also to Dr. Henry Louis Gates for directing this institute that I'm very, very grateful to be part of. I'm going to start my talk with, wait, this is not working? Okay, yeah. With a little bit of context on the project that I'm engaging in, and just so that you understand where I'm coming from as a philosopher a little bit better. First, I am interested in thinking about how policing shapes the moral lives of the people that they come into contact with. And my theoretical background, for people who are philosophers in the room or even not philosophers, is a Republican one. And I don't mean by that the like Trump MAGA republicanism. Republicanism in philosophy refers to a consequentialist political tradition that takes seriously the idea of non-domination as an ideal, and just interested in furthering non-domination. And also this paper is part of a larger project where I am arguing for what I'm calling a service conception of law enforcement, basically saying that we need to think about what we want police officers to be doing, so the services that we want them to be providing for us, and then working our way backward from there. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the various stages that is during lunch. And yeah, just to give a little bit of personal context that Chuck already referred to, I am interested in this project for personal reasons. So this is a map of San Diego, California, where I grew up. And the red dots represent immigration checkpoints. So as you can see, you basically can't go anywhere outside of like central San Diego without having to cross an immigration checkpoint, where you will be asked, who are you? Are you a US citizen? Where are you going? And all sorts of different questions. And growing up there, I'm interested in thinking about like what that does to a person to be surrounded by these forces of policing. And yeah, so that's like my personal motivation for that. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I think my role as a political philosopher is in thinking about policing. And I'm including a quote here from a philosopher named Philip Pettit. Can I ask Harry Allen to read it for us in your best philosopher voice? Also known as the media assassin for Public Enemy. Yeah. Oh, sure, yeah.
Politics has a conversational, deliberative aspect. And if the role of political philosophy is to integrate the languages in which such conversation is carried forward and, if necessary, invent or reinvent terms and idioms that may aid clarification and facilitate convergence. Philip Pettit, Republicanism.
Thank you, Harry Allen. Yeah, so as political philosophers, I think that part of our role in doing what we do is to help shape civic discourse and get us to a point of agreement by investigating the concepts and the language that we use to think about these very complicated topics that we engage with in the public sphere. And the concept that I'm interested in for my work is the concept of legitimate political authority. And in particular, I'm interested in 3 questions surrounding this concept of legitimate police authority, The first is, do police have legitimate political authority? In the United States, by the way. The context that I'm talking about for this talk is in the United States. Second, must we, morally speaking, obey the directives of police officers? So when a police officer asks you to do something, is it the case that you have a moral duty or moral obligation to actually do as they say in virtue of that person being a police officer? And third, and also kind of a related question, are police directives merely as binding as the threat of force behind them? So when they ask you to do something, do you have a moral obligation, or is it just, because they're threatening you, or because in the United States they have guns? Are those the reasons why you should do as they say? I'm going to start with explaining what I take to be the standard view and what the standard answers to those questions are. According to the standard view, law needs coercive power and to be able to maintain social control. So we have laws, but we also want those laws to be enforced in a way. And so we also need administrators, legal administrators, to implement the coercive power of law. And so that's who police officers are in the standard view. And because of their connection to law and to the coercive power of law and to legal authority, they also inherit legal authority and the authorization to use coercive power against people. And so according to the standard view, these are the answers to the questions that I posted in the previous slide. Do police in the United States have legitimate authority? Their answer would be, well, if you think that law has legitimate authority, then yes, the police officers do as well. Must we, morally speaking, obey the directives of police officers? Well, again, because the authority of police officers comes from the authority of law, if you think that you have a moral obligation or a moral duty to obey law, then you also have a moral duty to obey police officers. And then finally, are police directives merely as binding as the threat of force behind them? The answer would be no. They're exactly as binding as law itself is, because the authority of a police officer is just the authority of law. So hopefully this, even if you haven't thought about this too hard, seems a little bit familiar or tracks what some people think about the police in the United States. And I understand that this isn't the only way of viewing police officers, but on an abstract level, I'm claiming that this tracks the mainstream views that we have in the country.
Yes.
Thank you. So there are some pros to this view, some things that I like about this view. For one, it's intuitive. So it does kind of make sense because police officers are legal officials. There really isn't a way to think that they're not. And they are administrators of law. So it seems like the standard view gets that right, at least. Laws also require compliance with police. So in the United States, in most states, we have laws that require compliance. And that, in fact, make it illegal not to obey the directives of police officers. So the standard view also seems to get that right in saying that, well, the authority of law and the reasons that you have to comply with police officers just transfer over from the authority of law. And also, this view can sometimes help us explain the moral permissibility of disobedience to police officers. So if you think that our legal system is unjust and you think that the authority of police officers is just the authority of law, then you can draw a pretty straight line from our obligations to obey law are weakened in virtue of injustice to our obligations to obey police officers are weakened in virtue of injustice. But I don't like this view for some reasons. One, I think it oversimplifies the concept of law. And by that I mean, it just kind of oversimplifies the fact that there's so many kinds of responsibilities.
Not to interrupt you, you mean, when you say you're speaking of your previous slide, correct?
What do you mean?
When you're speaking of pros and cons, you're speaking of the slide you just showed, which
Yes, of the standard view. Yes.
Standard view,
Yes. No problem. So yeah, it oversimplifies the concept of law because there are a ton of different kinds of legal officials in the legal system, and there's also a bunch of different kinds of responsibilities and roles and duties and liabilities that these different legal officials have within that system. And the standard view doesn't account for the nuances in the kind of different kinds of authority that different kinds of legal officials could have within a legal system. And on the same note, it's also not fine-grained enough to make sense of really important differences that I think exist in the relationship between law and people and the relationship between people and police. And I think that it's important to investigate these two kinds of relationships to be able to conceptualize and think about legitimate police authority. So let's start by thinking about the law-people relationship. In my view, there are a few defining features of this relationship. One of them is that law issues general directives to people, meaning that, by the way, there's a law in Massachusetts that says you can't rent out your dog to somebody else, right? And so this is part of the penal system, and it just says, that renting out your dog will result in a fine of like no less than $1,000 or something like that. And note that code doesn't say Itzel should not rent out her dog Plato to Chuck. And that's because we want our laws to be general and to not speak to individuals specifically for it to work. It just wouldn't really make sense if we had to have, individual laws that codify every kind of prohibited behavior and also every individual and the different combinations of that. I mean, maybe with AI now that might be a possibility, but even that seems kind of impractical now. I also want to say that the law-people relationship can be one-sided. And by that I mean law isn't something that comes to us and says, hey, don't do that. It's something that we as individuals kind of think about abstractly and use to make our decisions when even in private, right? So like we don't have like an actual personal relationship with law in the normal case. We do have interactions with legal officials, but with this like abstract concept of law, it's just one-sided. It's just us trying to figure out what it is we're supposed to be and not supposed to be doing, with help, of course. Another thing is that I do think that legal directives create a duty to obey them. So meaning when law says, do X or don't do X, it is the case that we have duties to, in fact, do X or not do X in most cases. And finally, law has a hierarchical structure. And by that I mean, this might be a little bit controversial, but I'm just referring to the idea in political philosophy that we take law to be above individuals and that we submit ourselves to law in some sense in order to have the kind of society that we want to have, in order to have order, social order. And if you're not super convinced by that, I would appeal here to the fact that we often say things like no one is above the law, right? That's something that we've heard in our civic discourse pretty often. Just this idea that we're below law in some way, or that it's like this overarching umbrella that's above us. And this view of law is important. Oh no, I went all the way back. Okay. Right, so this is important because as political philosophers, often what we want to do is distinguish between law and just plain coercive power. And we think that there's a difference between our legal system and a bank robber who says, hey, give me the money, or who tells a teller, give me the money or I'm gonna shoot you. And we want there to be a difference because we want to be able to explain why actually it is the case that we have moral duties to obey law. And the bank robber, notice, is different than the law because his directives are going to be particularized, meaning it's saying, you there, give me that money right there. It's also individual to individual, right? So it's not like this abstract concept and this abstract relationship that we each have with bank robbers, at least I hope not. Also, when a bank robber tells a bank teller to do something, that does not create duties to obey. It's not the case that the bank teller now has a moral obligation to do as he says just because he's robbing the bank and he has a gun or something. And in terms of whether the presence of a bank robber creates some kind of hierarchy or some kind of like authority relationship, I want to say no. I think that what the bank robber has against the bank teller in this case would be like temporary ascendancy over the bank teller, meaning that you have this like temporary ability to try to get somebody to do what you want. Okay, so law is general, the bank robber is particularized, law is, the relationship we have with law is one-sided, the relationship that the bank teller has with the bank robber is individual to individual. Law creates duty to obey. The directives of a bank robber do not create a duty to obey. And law is above us in a way, but bank robbers are not. They just have like a temporary ability to do these things. So here's the thing, I actually think that the police-people relationship resembles the bank robber and bank teller relationship. Why? Well, police officers do issue particularized directives, right? Like we interact with them and they specifically say, hey, pull over, or all the other things that they do. The relationship that we have and the interactions that we have with them are individual to individual. Their directives do not create a duty to obey, and I'll explain why in a minute. Or at least that's what I'm going to be arguing. And I also think that police officers have temporary ascendancy over people, at least in democratic egalitarian societies. So in contexts where we have a democracy and we think that all people are equal, we don't really think the fact that somebody puts on a police officer uniform makes them like a higher status citizen or something in a society like this. Okay, so where do we go from here? Given that it looks like police are more like bank robbers than like law. Well, option one, we could just say, look, police don't actually have legitimate authority. They just are like bank robbers, and we should treat them as such, and we should think of them as such. Option two, though, is I want to take seriously the idea that the police are similar to bank robbers for the reasons that I just stated, but also they have an important connection to law that tells us something about the way that they use their power in our society. And so I want to argue for option two. I want to show that actually there is a way to make sense of this gray area that police officers tend to exist in, but it requires us to rethink what we think legitimate police authority is. And so to do that, I want to introduce what I'm calling the police power liability view. And the view in technical terms says this. Should we have Harry Allen read it again? Okay. Insofar as police officers have legitimate political authority, the exercise of police power will change the moral situation of the people police have authority over by making them liable to the exercise of police power. Okay, what does this mean? I need to first explain what all of these terms mean. Let's start with the word power. A power is a kind of relational advantage that allows somebody to do something to the addressee of power. And you can think of this just in a very abstract way, right? Like if I have physical power over you, then that means that, maybe I can physically hurt you or detain you or things like that. If I have intellectual power over you, I have the power to make you accept, conclusions of arguments that I make or manipulate you in some way. So power is just this idea that you can do something to somebody. But I'm not saying that police just have power, right? I'm saying that they have moral power. And so moral power is the ability to do something to the moral situation of the person that you're exercising power over. And you might say, okay, what does that mean? What would that even look like? Well, one example of moral power is the power of consent, right? So if you have the power of consent, you can make it the case that you change the moral situations of other people. So for example, if James was to come to my house and he starts eating the food that is on my table, that in a lot of cases would be trespassing. But if I consent to him coming to my house, and in fact, like I invited you over for dinner or something, then that trespass, actually, we would call it a dinner party. You know, similarly, like a surgeon, you know, a doctor who amputates a limb or something, that would be assault, but when you have consent, that is medical treatment. So you can think of moral power as just the ability to change the situations of the people that you're exercising that power over. Okay, and then finally, liability. To say that someone is liable to another person is to say that the moral claims against the other person that they're liable to, that they lack particular moral claims or moral standing that they can make regarding another person. Again, this might not make that much sense, but suppose that I am at a club and a DJ is very rude to me, and the DJ hits me or something. And then I hit the DJ back. What that would mean is that the DJ couldn't complain and say, hey, that girl hit me, because the response would be, yeah, but you hit her first. And so you made yourself liable to be hit back. And so you can think of liability as this, this moral thing that changes the kinds of claims that you can make in particular situations. So what I'm saying is that police have the ability, have the moral power to change our moral situations, and that creates a liability to police power. And the ways that police can change our moral situations vary because of how much discretion they have in this country. But you can think, right, like they have the ability to fine us, right? Then that creates obligations in us to pay fines. They can limit our rights, for example, our right to privacy, and they can do this in lots of different ways, even just by surveying us, right? Like just standing on a corner of a street, or when they stop you when you're driving in your car. They can also remove your ability to be in certain areas, right? If the police say, hey, this area is closed off, you now have an obligation not to be there. And they also can choose whether or not to charge you with crimes, which changes your moral relationship with the state and with the legal system. And all of these, what they do is create liabilities to police officers and to the exercise of legitimate police authority. All right, so how does this get us to option 2? And recall option 2 saying that police authority exists somewhere between the spectrum of legal authority and the power that a bank robber has over a bank teller. Well, first we can say, okay, police are similar to bank robbers in the way that their directives work. So that's all the stuff I was talking about, where they're particularized, individual to individual, and they exercise coercive power. But they're also similar to law in the fact that they can actually change our moral situations. And law also does this by creating, as I had said before, a duty to obey it. So when something becomes law, your moral situation changes insofar as you now have like a new moral duty to do whatever it is that law says. Okay, so what are the implications? Where does this get us if you think that police authority is a power, a moral power to change the situation of people? Well, one of the things that you can say is, because the exercise of police power creates liability to police power, it's not necessarily the case that it creates a duty to obey the directives of that police power, even when that authority is legitimate. And why is that? Well, because liability just is a different thing than an obligation or than a moral duty. And so this view would make it conceptually possible for us to hold the following 2 views about police in the United States. One, you can think that police in the United States have legitimate political authority, but that there's no moral duty to obey the directives of police authority in the United States. And so this can help us change the way that we see certain kinds of situations that happen. And I'll start with this example. So this is a sketch of the courtroom of the trial of Derek Chauvin, who you might know for murdering George Floyd. This is when he was convicted of second-degree murder and third-degree murder and manslaughter. So lots of people, I'm not gonna like recount what happened, right? Because I think we're probably all aware of that. There were protests, right, that sparked all across the world that saw what he did as a horrific abuse of police power. But there were some segments of our population, and in fact, you know, this is the argument that his lawyers made, that said, well, actually, the force that he used was not excessive because of Floyd's size, and they pointed, and because of the fact that he wasn't complying with Chauvin. So they pointed at the non-compliance as a reason to accept that what Chauvin did was actually reasonable or acceptable. And again, this is the argument that was made during the trial. And so the conclusion of that is that, well, actually the death was a, you know, unfortunate accident that he feels really bad for, and it wasn't really, it wasn't really his fault, and we know this because he wasn't complying. So that argument, I want to say, well, first of all, it's morally flawed and racist. It depends on premises that, you know, it's a dangerous reasoning about Black people and about Black men in particular. But I also want to say that using my view, we can explain that in addition to those moral mistakes that supporters of Chauvin were making, they're also making a conceptual mistake about what police authority actually is and what it entails and what it means when a police officer tells somebody to do something, and in particular what it meant when Derek Chauvin asked Floyd to get into his car and he did not. And so what I want to say here is that an interpretation of that situation is that, well, look, even if we assume that Derek Chauvin had legitimate authority as a police officer, we still would need an argument for why Floyd had to obey him in the first place. And I'm not saying that that argument couldn't be made. I'm just saying, at least in philosophy, it hasn't been made really. And then if we have this conversation in the public sphere, I have a feeling that the more arguments would fail, would just not work very well. And so we can shift the burden of proof in these conversations to say, you know, right now it would be like saying, George Floyd had to obey, and that it was wrong that he didn't. But now we can say, well, you have to explain to me why Floyd would have had to obey in the first place, because that's not what it means to say that a police officer has legitimate political authority. Let's look at a different case. The Adams family in 2015 had their home seized by, this is not an actual picture of the Adams family, by the way, had their home seized by the police because their son who lived with them sold $60 of marijuana. And so in the United States, we have this practice in some states called a civil asset forfeiture, where the police can just take your things if they think that it's part of you committing a crime, or if they prove that it's part of you committing a crime. So they lost their house because their son was, you know, like a drug dealer when living with them. So they took their home away. Yes. And so what can the police power liability view get us here? Well, first of all, something similar to what it can get us in the Floyd case, where you can say, well, look, even if it was the case that the police legitimately took their home, they didn't necessarily have to comply when the police officers are there telling them to get out. But more than that, I think the police power liability view can also explain the special moral wrong that was done to the family. And it can explain the special moral wrong better than justice-based views could. So if you think that the police taking this house was unjust, which I'm assuming most people do, you might also think, well, if it was unjust, then the exercise of their power was also illegitimate. And so, at the end of the day, they didn't really do anything. But I want to say, well, it actually seems like they did do something. That's why we think that this family was wronged. And what they did was change the moral situation of the Adams family in relation to their house, right? Like they actually lost the right to their house. And so if you think that it was just illegitimate, there's going to be a little bit of trouble there, I think, to explain why it was also a wrong. All right, so, I also, going back to what I was saying earlier about the role of philosophers in helping to shape civic discourse, I think that this view in general provides an important point of agreement between people who disagree about whether police in this country have legitimate political authority. And that's because for people that think that police do have legitimate political authority in this country, they can keep thinking that, but they can now also acknowledge that there is egregious abuse going on in the system, and not have to, soften the egregiousness of that abuse in order to preserve their claim that that police have legitimate political authority. On the other hand, if you think something like injustice makes police authority in the United States illegitimate, then you can maintain the intuitions that are making you skeptical in the first place, and you can also think that they do have legitimate political authority, and that's part of the problem with the abuses and with the injustice that they're perpetuating. You can also think that you might be more willing to accept that police do have legitimate political authority if that doesn't mean that people who are affected by injustices have a duty to obey that authority, if that makes sense. And so this view might even justify more radical ideas, because you can think that, well, look, not only do you not have a duty to obey police officers, but even if the system was like perfectly just, even if the institution was perfectly just, you still might not have that obligation. Okay, so just really quickly for the philosophers in the room, some theoretical points. So my views compatible with Thomas Hobbes, who argues in Leviathan that you don't actually have to submit to state authority when your life is in danger. It is also compatible with Arthur Applebaum and James Buchanan's views, who they argue, for a version of the same thing, which is basically that you can have legitimate authority or political legitimacy without a duty to obey that authority. And also, finally, it's also something that I would consider a legal positivist understanding of the relationship between morality and law enforcement, because you don't need to subscribe to any particular view of morality, or really any view of morality, to conceptualize legitimate police authority. And the reason why, and this is again for everybody, the account is a view of what police authority is, and not of the right moral standards for getting and keeping it. And so I'm saying, like, what it means for a police officer to exercise authority is that they change the moral situation of the people that they exercise authority over. But the question of, like, when do we give that to police officers, or what are the moral standards for doing that, is a separate, I think important, but separate question. And then in terms of, and so I'm calling those views that tell us when police should have authority and when they can keep it, I'm calling these substantive views on policing. And the police power liability view is compatible with a few different ones. Jake Monahan wrote a book called Just Policing, and he argues that we need to think about the kinds of risks that certain police actions pose to legitimacy. And I think that my view is compatible with that, because you can think that you don't need to think that there's a duty to obey the directives of police officers in order to think that they should exercise their power thoughtfully and with regard to what kinds of effects it would have on legitimacy. Olufemi Taiwo wrote this great piece called The Power of Policing, where he advocates for a communitarian model of policing, where it's really interesting. I would recommend reading that paper if any of you guys have the chance. Basically, the view is that we would make it more democratic by randomly picking people in neighborhoods to serve on police committees, and they would then decide what kinds of powers police should or should not have for their own neighborhoods. And the important point that he makes there is that a lot of the other reform strategies that we have don't really work as well, because the main issue with policing is the fact that they have this power, and that the power dynamic is inverted such that we are scared of their power, but in reality they should be scared of of the power of people. And so I think that that's a view that goes really nicely with what I'm saying. And then finally, you could also be a police abolitionist. And the interpretation of the abolitionist view here would be that they're saying that no amount of liability to police power can be justified. And I'm not an abolitionist or an anarchist, at least not, this view does not entail that. But it is compatible with a more radical solution if that's what you wanted to do. Okay, so let's go back to the questions that I started with. Do police have legitimate political authority? My answer to that, in the United States, my answer to that is yeah, it's possible, and you shouldn't think that they don't just because they don't, just because of the injustices that we see. And I think to think of the right view of what good policing would look like, we need to think about what kinds of powers we want them to have and assess our liabilities to those powers individually. Must we, morally speaking, obey the directives of police officers? No, not necessarily. We need arguments about why we would have to in the first place. And again, these arguments haven't really been made in political philosophy or legal philosophy. And I think that, you know, just if we had that conversation in civic discourse, I'm not sure that the answer would be yes anyway. And then finally, are police directives merely as binding as the threat of force behind them? No, I think they are more than that. You know, I do think there's a difference between the authority of a police officer and the power that a bank robber holds over a bank teller. Yeah, here's my email in case anybody wants to reach out with any questions or comments, or if anybody wants to help me publish this, that would be pretty cool. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Tantalizing. Two questions. First, I want to interrogate the conceptual status of the concept of legitimacy, both analytically and also through the lens of critical theory. Analytically, to say that something is legitimate is premised on the inarticulated argument that there are certain transcendental conditions that concept must satisfy in order for it to legitimately function as an organizing principle of practices. The second one, from the lens of a critical theory of society, there are forces, invisible forces it seems, that confer legitimacy on some people, in this instance, the police, without articulating the transcendental conditions that must be satisfied in order for the police to direct us.
Thank you. Yeah, so maybe I'll just quickly say something about the first thing that you said, as legitimacy as a kind of, or entailing transcendent conditions. So it sounds like I am doing something closer to what you were describing as critical theory, where you can just say this is something like a status as opposed to a procedure that they must go through in order to get legitimacy. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. My name is Amber Henry. I have two questions. One about places where you might find them to be extremely instructive, other countries where the policing rules are things that we can learn from. And the other is about whether policing laws and this people-police relationship should apply differently to members of the community or outsiders. My maternal family is from Barbados, where there is a national law that non-police and non-army cannot wear combat gear, the kind of camouflage combat gear. And year after year, tourists, often from the US, show up on vacation and they're wearing combat gear and they're fined because they're not military. So can you speak a little bit about how we reconcile with police relationships that might not apply to everyone, or should they? And then are there spaces outside of the United States that you find extremely instructive? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. To your first question, yes, I'm thinking, and I assume this is what you had in mind, thinking about the Latin American context specifically. And I'm writing a paper and researching right now how that police has become militarized, but not in the way that we think it has in the US, where we have policing who have adopted military tactics and gear and those things. Instead, what's happening over there is that the military is adopting policing tactics. So it's kind of a militarization that's going the other way. And so I'm interested in thinking about how that affects, similar questions to what I'm talking about here, but in that context, and especially given, very real security concerns that are happening, and what that tells us about policing authority. And then the other one is, your other question was about whether laws should apply to outsiders, or yeah. How do you think about that? Yeah, honestly, I don't think about it that much. I do think about it in terms of like what duties states have to people who are non-citizens, and maybe just really broadly, I'd say that because I care about non-domination, that's something that I think that extends to people who, that's not something that's like relevant or contingent on citizenship status. So if you think that the state and that its policing forces should be trying to limit the amount of arbitrary interference that is happening to people, or that people are subject to, then you would think that that's the case for anybody really, not just people who are citizens.
Hello? Okay. Thank you very much for your paper. The poster, it's...
Justin.
It's brilliant. Okay, so I have two questions. The first was when you started, you showed us like the red dots where people had to navigate. I wonder if you could speak more on that, if you have like any anecdotal, evidence from, people's interactions and how their interactions with police within those spaces enable them to, or help them create different types of strategies of navigating those circumscribed, locations. That's the first question. The second question, which I was thinking about as you were proceeding with your presentation, was on the question of obeying the directives of police from a moral perspective. And I wondered that perhaps it might help with, I would want to believe, is this a finished paper or is it a work in progress? So maybe that can help me sort of modulate my question. Let's assume it's a work in progress. I would think that it might be good to sort of lay down an argument, about what the sort of clash that could occur between the moral perspective and how people could push back on what is justice, order, and governance, right? Like, if people can sort of argue that they have the moral directive or the moral sort of persuasion not to always obey police, how then can we justify a society that must be governed? How do we create a society that is ordered? how do we create a society that is just if there are no structures and hierarchies? I know you did mention it, but I think that it might be great to sort of, lay down that argument and whilst, foregrounding your argument as well. So I wonder if you may have thought about that and how you can sort of, push that argument forward.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the first question again, how do we navigate the red dots in San Diego? So maybe one quick anecdote I can tell is based on when I was teaching at Cal State Long Beach when I was a grad student. And we were reading Kant, and we were talking about, how his ideas translate into a world that has so much wrong with it. And one of the things that we realized in the context of this conversation was that I think there were maybe 4 or 5 students who had the exact same interaction in those red dots, including myself. And the interaction was like this. They were driving with their family in a white minivan, all of them in a white minivan, and they were asked to stop, and then the ICE officers asked them if they're citizens, and then they gave their answers, and then they asked the whole family to get out of the car, and they strip searched the car. And so that's one of the things that just kind of happens. They'll pull you over for a broken tail light and not think twice about it, and then suddenly you're being asked whether or not you're a U.S. citizen and kind of trying to prove it, but they're not really supposed to ask you to prove it, so it's just very strange. And then if you're asking about practical tips, one thing that I know is that sometimes the checkpoints close when it rains. So you can, they're not open when it rains. And also if you're visiting from Mexico or something, you have to get a special visa that you should present when you're at those if you're asked to. So those are kind of some of the ways that, that those interactions go down, if that is helpful. And then, in terms of laying down an argument for how do we get, so if I'm saying you don't have a moral duty to obey police, how do we get social order? Right, so I'm saying that we can still get social order, we just maybe shouldn't be thinking about the police getting us there. Instead, what we try to do is get the police to do certain things for us, and maybe maintaining social order isn't the end-all be-all of what we want them to be doing. Maybe we want their presence to give us assurance that the rest of us aren't going to be, breaking law just because we can, and we know that police officers will stop us. So in that sense, they will help us maintain social order. But in terms of, enforcing public order laws, maybe we don't want them to be doing that. So maybe we don't want them to be moving homeless people, or maybe we don't want them to be responding to mental health crises, or maybe we don't want them to have guns or things like that. Yeah, and I am working on that's a separate paper, but yeah, not for this one.
All right, thank you for your presentation. It's really thought-provoking. I guess my question has to do with the relationship between history and the applicability of your kind of theoretical formulation here. So I'm looking at this picture of James Baldwin, and he's kind of staring at me. I'm thinking of a conversation that he had with Nika Giovanni in 1971, and they're talking about the police. And Baldwin says, a cop is a cop, right? He may be a very nice person, right? But he don't have time to figure that out. All he knows is that this person has a uniform and a gun, and he has to relate to him that way because one of us might die. Okay? And he's speaking about a historical relationship between black people and the police, and a history of anti-blackness that results in black death. Right? And there's no time to think about kind of the moral implications of that relationship, to think about, okay, what type of authority, what type of moral power do I have in this split-second moment where my life could literally end. So I'm wondering, how do you kind of make sense of the history of policing, particularly in relationship to particular communities, i.e. African Americans, and a history of anti-Blackness, and how then, if this is even kind of applicable to the everyday? That's fair.
Yeah, thank you for that. He also has this great essay, the report from Occupied Territory, where he, talks about that dynamic as well and how they, police presence shapes and turns Harlem, I believe he was talking about, into like a militarized zone even when it wasn't supposed to be. And so I think of the injustice of police for the purposes of this paper specifically as like the reason why we should think about it a little bit closer. Because if we have this like assumption in the public sphere where you say, well, we just have a duty to obey police officers, like I think it's worth interrogating that. But I also take your point that the streets are not the place for doing that, right? Like that's not the appropriate context for doing it. Maybe the appropriate context for doing it is something like this in academia. And so in that sense, I think going back to like the bank robber that I was explaining, the bank teller needs to make a split decision about whether or not they're going to do what the bank robber says. And they don't have time to, sit there and like philosophize about the legitimacy of what they're doing or like the morality of the consequences of what's going to happen, right? Like you just kind of have to, it's reactive. And so I think that is how police power works in everyday life in those contexts. And that's exactly right, that like, the reasons you would have until we like maybe write a book about, philosophize about it more, prove morally that there is an obligation to obey police officers. I think that the reasons that we have for doing that now is precisely for what you're saying. Like that is how it works. Yeah.
Thank you, Itzel. I really appreciate your talk. You mentioned Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan in the part that he argued that a person do not have to submit to the state power where he is in danger. But in the same book he said he starts from the assumption that the homo homini lupus, that means the man is a wolf for the other man. Mm-hmm. And my question is possible apply in your research this concept of homo homini lupus to justify the coercive power that the police have with the people? Thank you.
Yeah, I do think so. And I think that is the argument for why we would want police in the first place, is because of the prospect of domination from other people. And so we want the state to be doing something about that, right? Like we want some kind of assurance, protection from each other. But I think the issue that I'm trying to think about now is how we create this like second order degree of the same problem, second order version of the same problem, where we're worried about domination from each other. So that's why we have police. But now we're worried about domination from police, right? So that's like something that Hobbes doesn't really talk about. So Hobbes is addressing kind of the first order problem. But now we're worried about like the power that police can have over us. So what do we do about that? And like I was telling Amber earlier, the answer in some contexts have been like, okay, well, we'll bring in the military to take care of the police. But then we have a third order problem because now we're worried about the military. So I think the Hobbesian argument gets us to an explanation of the first problem, but it doesn't really give us that many recommendations for what happens after that and what happens in the context that we're in now. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Itzel Adriana from the Safra Center. Can you perhaps show the slide with the police power liability view, just to keep in mind those 4 points as I ask my question?
Oh, wait.
Yeah, exactly. No, that one.
This one, right?
Yeah, and the next one, maybe. okay. No, don't worry about that.
Okay.
I'll ask my question, and then maybe if I need some information, you'll know what it is. Okay, so you said that maybe it was the slide about like what makes our relationship with the police officer similar to the bank robber. I think that with 4 points. I think that was the slide that I was thinking of. So I guess my question has to do with if part of the reasons that in your view justify the idea that we don't have a moral obligation to obey police officers have to do with the fact that they have an individual relationship with us, unlike the law. I was thinking about what are the implications of your view for other officers who are not police officers, but officers of the state that relate to us in a one-on-one basis, like whatever a bureaucrat, street-level bureaucrat, like is it the case that because they are deciding, maybe they're not police, but they are deciding to issue like a fine, maybe not enforce, they don't have the ability to enforce the payment of the fine, but they decide that you deserve a fine for whatever, right? So what are the implications of that view for other officers that also have a one-on-one relationship to us? And if we don't necessarily have a moral obligation to obey them. And also, what would it be, how would you feel about police officers if they didn't have, yes, they have the one-on-one relationship, of course, but they didn't have the ability to hurt or harm people. So if a police officer is without a gun, and suppose you know that he or she doesn't have a gun, and is not being violent. I mean, there's a problem that you were talking about like there is no time to figure out. But imagine that there's no, he's unarmed, and so in that case, would you feel that we have a moral obligation to say like, hey, I'm the keeper of order here. I know that you made these mistakes or probably commit a crime, so I need to take you to trial. I don't have a gun. Just come with me. Would you feel that would mean that the moral situation, as you call it, of the person is not modified in a way that there is no, that the liability situation doesn't come up, so that you have a moral obligation to? Is it the case, in other words, is it the case that you think that we don't have a moral obligation because your life is in danger? And if that's not the case, then there's no problem. You have the moral obligation because, he's sort of like representing the law. So what I'm wondering is what exactly is in your argument is leading you to the conclusion that we don't have a moral obligation? Is it the violence? Is it the one-on-one? What exactly is making that work in the argument? Sorry.
Sure, yeah. So regarding me pointing out the differences between the two relationships was more of a motivation to be like, here are some like important differences in the ways that we think about law and the ways that we think about our relationships with police. And so that's kind of more against the standard view. And then in terms of my argument for saying like, why don't we have a moral obligation to obey police? I think that the power liability view just kind of like gets it right in the sense that it seems to track the different ways and the different powers that they are able to exercise, and the fact that it just seems obvious to me that when they change your moral situation, that doesn't always create an obligation to obey. So it's not really that your life is in danger, like that's not really what's doing the work. It's, I guess, more like I think I'm relying more on the explanatory power of what the view can do rather than giving like a positive deductive argument for like, here's why this is the right way. I'm just saying like, hey, there's this view that kind of can help explain this dynamic without, having to get into why police power is just like legal authority. Does that make sense? So if it's not the fact that you're being harmed. You're right. So then what is it exactly? Can you say that again just to clarify? Yeah, what I was saying is that I don't have an answer really. Like I'm not giving like a deductive argument here, like a positive reason to say like here is why this is the best way to think about police power. I'm just saying that, like, if we do think about it this way, there's a lot of good that can come out of that in terms of like our civic discourse and the way that we are having these conversations, like in the Derek Chauvin case and in the Adams case. Yeah, so it's more about the like clarifying and like, hey, this is something that like we could agree on potentially.
Yes. Thank you. Itzel, thank you for an immensely thought-provoking presentation. Last night at the reception, I mentioned to you that in a couple of weeks I'm going to be giving the sermon at the church I attend, and I was going to invite my fellows or anyone who wanted to attend to this sermon, and you were so kind to say, "Oh, I'll be there," and were really very affirming, and it made me feel really good that you were giving that kind of attention. What I didn't tell you is that the title of the sermon is "The Unity of the Law." So I don't know if that might make it more interesting to you or not, but it just something that occurred to me as I was watching this. I wanted to ask 3 questions, and they're really short ones. The first one is the title of your presentation. It seems like it's missing the word other, as in police and other people, unless you're making a critique of police and that they're not really people or not people like. I was just wondering if that was like a really subtle dig at police.
Not on purpose. So I'll say 2 things is that, so like in my dissertation, I dedicated it to everybody but the police. So that was a dig at the police. And then for this, I honestly just like didn't really know what to call the paper. And I asked ChatGPT to come up with the title. And this is what it came up with. And I like tweaked it a little bit, but I don't know. I was just like completely out of imagination when it was time to. So that's my secret. If anybody can think of something better, okay, if you're creative, you can tell me.
I think it's fine otherwise.
Or other people, yeah.
I was wondering, in the example of the bank robber, if a bank robber comes with those relationships to power and to other people, isn't it appropriate that we equip a person with the exact same relative powers, but just in the opposite direction? Like the bank robber is the negative version of those powers and those assumptions, and the police officer mounts in that moment the opposites, the same exact kind of relationships, but in the positive direction. Is it clear what I'm asking?
Yeah.
What I'm asking?
Yeah, and I think, so the point that you're making, I do actually talk about in the paper a little bit, but like maybe in a slightly different context. And I am talking about like what the Black Panthers were doing. That sounds like a version of what you're saying, where we have police who are, killing people in Oakland. So what do? Well, they arm themselves and then like watch the police and do like the cop watching that they were doing. And then the Brown Berets who, fashioned themselves after the Black Panthers in LA. They were a Chicano group who did something similar in LA. And I think that that's also a solution to the second order domination problem that I'm saying. And the interpretation from the point of view that I'm talking about is saying that, well, okay, we can be liable to police in this way if we want them to have guns, but only if we have the power of self-defense to make them liable in the back. But I think there are issues with...
To stop escalation, so to speak.
So that's the idea, right? Or at least like there's 2 ways to see that, as stopping escalation or as just like a claim to the right of self-defense against that kind of liability. And so like I think the claim to the right of self-defense, that makes sense, but I'm not sure that it would actually stop escalation. And that's kind of related to what I was saying earlier about stopping the second order problem of policing with military. It just seems like you're increasing the amount of domination that's happening, which seems bad to me.
And then the last question is, how familiar are you with the online phenomenon of First Amendment auditors?
Not at all.
These are people who, equipped with video cameras, will go into public spaces like post offices or city halls, et cetera, and just videotape what's going on, and especially videotape government officials as they do their duties. And those government officials inevitably resist this and ask not to be videotaped, and then typically call the police, which then invites a confrontation with police. And I think it's really an interesting set of demonstrations about how people who have a working knowledge of how the law works interact with police and how it changes the way those interactions go. There's a whole series of these videos that are just called ID refusals, and just have to do with the police asking for ID in some situation, the person saying, no, you're violating my Fourth Amendment, which is not something most people would think to say, but they do because they work with these ideas and they just document. And it's fascinating to see how the police, who think this is going to be an innocuous interaction, suddenly have to change their whole bearing because they realize I'm dealing with someone who has some grasp on how the law works. So it's a fascinating area. I'm hoping to get some of those guys who do this work up here to Harvard sometime this year, and maybe that's something with which you could be involved if you have the time.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I hadn't really heard of that, but I saw something similar to what you're describing on TikTok, where it was somebody passing through the Mexican border, and when they were asked, like, you know, are you a citizen, or like, you know, the other questions they asked, they just like they didn't respond.
That's a whole genre as well.
Right.
Border checks and stops.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I've seen that, and that sounds pretty similar as well.
And they're videotaping their interaction.
Yeah. There's also, never mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Itzel, this is so fascinating and so interesting. And I love that you're, you know, looking at this space of, I guess how I'm thinking of it as some sort of discretionary power of the police to make orders and to feel like these orders need to be obeyed. And so I'm wondering if you could help me understand maybe some of the distinction between maybe like our legal obligations to respond to the police and the moral obligation. For example, it seems clear-cut to me, at least logically, like, you know, related to what was just brought up. Like now, I don't know if there's city ordinances or state or law, there's like, okay, you need to stand a certain distance back from the police, and that's a law. And so I can understand a legal obligation if a police officer says, you know, you need to do this, and it's a law, or, you know, you are under arrest, and then there's sort of a series of things that then you are legally obligated. But, you know, you're supposed to, you know, roll down your window. If your window's rolled up, you know, now all of a sudden I'm ready to pull you out of the car, or you need to put out your cigarette, and now you're not putting out your cigarette, and so therefore, and so I think, you know, I myself, I think every citizen sort of is wondering, you know, what am I supposed to do when the police tell me to do it? So I guess, can you just maybe clarify a little bit this sort of what, you know, this idea of legal obligations? I mean, even if we understood, I'm not a person that understands all my ins and outs of like what I can and can't, you know, do that the police tell me what to do. And then sort of what you're investigating about this moral obligation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So the legal obligation, I think, would be a product of the laws that we have, or the, you know, depends what you think law is. Like if you think it includes principles, then maybe it would be a product of those moral principles too. So that, you know, I think one easy answer you can give is like, well, you have a legal obligation to do something if there's a law that requires you to do that thing. So if there's a legal obligation to obey police officers, would be the product of laws that require you to obey police officers, which we do have. You know, there's questions about like the constitutionality of those laws, but you know, that would be one way to think about legal obligation to obey police officers. When I'm talking about a moral obligation to obey police officers, I'm saying like, morally speaking, are you doing something wrong when you disobey a police officer, or if you disobey a police officer? Or is it morally required for you to obey the directives of a police officer in the same way that, you know, it's like morally required for me to, I don't know, be a good person, or like, you know, not harm people, or
Feed player.
yeah, feed my dog, that kind of thing. You know, like, exactly, like I think the dog one is a good example. If I neglected my dog or abused him, like you would think that there's something morally wrong with that, even if there isn't a law requiring me to do that. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm thinking is like, how then is that relating to how you might think some of these laws could change regarding how police interact. Like, for example, and maybe, and then this will be the end, but I mean, to what extent are certain communities saying, hey, police can ask this and you have to obey it, or you don't have to obey it? Like, maybe just being more specific about, police can't demand that you put out your cigarette or something like that. This is a little bit related to the question of sort of from the philosophy to the actual changing of, practical law, or, how it would work in society.
So are you asking like how to write laws requiring obedience, or
I guess what is the argument? What is the strength of potentially the argument of looking at it from a morality viewpoint that would affect how we think about laws around the police, or how does the moral discussion, the philosophical discussion, impact what the on the ground sort of reaction and.
Oh yeah, so it could maybe more in the sense of. I'm sorry, more in the sense of like when we're thinking about what we want those institutions to look like. Yeah, right. So like, I mean, this is a hard question, right? And I was talking to my friend Helen about this. It's like the question of my life, like what import does philosophy have to the real world? But yeah, I don't know, like maybe like shaping policy, like I said, influencing public discourse in contexts where it's important that we have some sort of collective understanding about what is happening. But in terms of, like I was telling him, in terms of like what should you do in the moment where you're asked to do something, I don't know that those moral arguments like are part of our reasoning. It's more like a habit of obedience, or like it could be seen as a way of, obedience could be seen as a form of self-preservation, or all sorts of different things, yeah. Not necessarily moral. Yeah.
Okay, well. Sharon, did you have a question? Me, Sharon? Yes. I do, but I'm going to defer to yes.
Okay, then I'm not taking your question. Marie Nicolini, Safra Center for Ethics. Thank you so much. I have a question about disentangling the morally transformative piece from moral power, because in thinking of two examples, one of which you mentioned, the doctor who amputates, right? That seemed to be there. It is true that the fact that the patient gives consent makes the act morally transformative. Something that would be an assault becomes a medical act. And that's grounded in consent, and it's grounded in trust of the relationship, but it doesn't grant the physician moral power. Like, right, so it's one thing to say it's morally transformative, it doesn't grant power. And I'm not saying that's what you said, right? I'm just thinking it's true. So that's one example. Another example is sexual relationships, where consent, again, is what makes something morally transformative that otherwise would be rape. And that too is consent grounded in trust. And so then thinking about your project and how it applies, it sounds like perhaps what the relationship between people and police could be, or what would be helpful, would be to specify the nature of that relationship and the place of trust, right? And perhaps civic trust. Like it seems like, so it's a separate question from should we obey, but also it seems like police should sort of earn their trust, right? Their civic trust of I might, listen to you and provide consent, and consent applies differently, right? Because we're talking about the law, but still, ideally, there would be a kind of understanding of civic trust where I know that you will not hurt me. And so the question is, can those kind of situations in ordinary civic life sort of inform this question? That is a political question.
Yeah, in terms of transformation, so I'm calling it a power because it's like the ability to, and you could call it transform as well. So it would be different. I haven't like fully thought this out, but I'm thinking that what a police officer is doing is going to be different than what a doctor is doing, because or like what consent is doing, because the police officer has the ability to like do that to somebody as opposed to like just like invoke something and change it, if that makes sense. so I'm saying they have the ability to, on their own, transform the moral situations of people that they exercise power over. So I'm not sure that we're saying like super different things, unless I don't understand what a moral transform.
Well, the thing is that if, in the case of the amputation, consent only will not be sufficient because it's not that just anyone can amputate someone, even if that other person gives them consent.
You need to have, yeah.
Right, and so that we think that really that fiduciary relationship is what does the work. And so again, that's a non-political situation, but yet that's part of the moral equation. And I wonder how that trust piece factors into the relationship.
Yes, yeah, I agree with you. I think that would be part of like the substantive account that you would be like maybe, I mean, we've been talking about this at the Saffron Center too, like the requirements of trust, or maybe that would be some kind of necessary background condition for having legitimate political authority. Yeah, but not for using it, not for like just what it means to use it. Yeah.
Because you might trust a doctor to do some kind of service that's not approved.
Well, they do the wrong way.
Well, did you?
Which happens
Frequently.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your presentation.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any ambiguity in your use of obey? That they have to obey, and what is there any ambiguity? Do they have to obey at that moment? Can they think about it? Is there a contextual framework for your articulation of obey?
Yeah, so this is something that I've been thinking about a bit lately. I think obedience requires more than just compliance, and then I guess, you know, if they have to do it right away, that would be a question of what exactly you're being asked to do. And that can be vague as well. Like if you're asking somebody to clean and then they take a few days to do it, like have they, or like, you know, they do it weeks later, have they really done it? Like if you ask your kid to do it or something. So I am shifting towards thinking about this more in terms of disobedience, because I think obedience there has to be some kind of, I don't know, some kind of attitude or belief about you being asked to do something and like doing it because, or, you know, in a way that's connected to that attitude or belief. I know it sounds really vague. So I'm starting to think about it more in terms of disobedience, because in the case of policing, I think that we can define disobedience pretty easily, and I think we can define it just as like not doing what they say, regardless of what like mental states or beliefs. And the reason why I think is because, you know, if we think that police are a solution to the assurance problem, to like, you know, we want to make sure that everybody else is following the law, then really what we care about is actions, right? Like we care about compliance and we care about disobedience in terms of non-compliance.
Thank you.
Thank you.